And new at 10 tonight, 10 Virginia colleges, including the University of Virginia, are asking Governor Glenn Youngkin for a meeting to discuss diversity, inclusion, and equity policy. In a letter to the governor, the student body presidents of these universities wrote they have concerns about the longevity of DEI in Virginia. Virginia's UVA student body president Valentina Mendoza says the request is not based on an encroachment on DEI. Instead, it's centered on having a proactive discussion.
How can we get to a place where we understand first and foremost what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, and how we can continue to support students and the student experience?
So far, Mendoza says the students have not heard back from the governor's office.